Hello, Plainview. As soon as I get this thing plugged in, we'll start working our way through the steps to the Civil War using that set of, I don't know if you guys even have it. Let me check first. You may not have it. I'm going to use a PowerPoint. You can follow on that PowerPoint if you want. If the computer will cooperate. But what we're going to look at, and this is not in anybody's book or anything like that, but what I have teaching about getting into the Civil War, kind of a list of maybe 10 events that happened, and I call them the steps to the Civil War. They're not I mean, we know what caused the Civil War, but they're just a progression of events, and some of them are pretty interesting. I spend more time on this than I do talking about the war itself. Come on, machine. Speak to me. There you go. Okay, let's go down to that Unit 9 and we're going to add something to it. You'll be able to see it in just a second. I've revised this so many times that I've got at least 20 versions of this, but I think this is the best one. And I probably should have put this in before I put the other ones in, but let's take a look at it. The name of it is Mexican-American War to the Civil War. It's a really long PowerPoint. It shouldn't take too long for it to attach itself for you. And we're going to go about halfway into it. We're going to go part way into it. It's just got good slides on it. There we go. You should have it now. Well, let's see if I can get it to open on my computer. There we go. It's the American Civil War to the Civil War. The Mexican-American War to the Civil War, that is. And we're going to start about slide 20-something, I think. We talked about the Mexican-American War. We talked about Polk's achievements as president. He only lasted for one presidency. He didn't run again. He didn't ask to run again. And I think last time we talked about the Wilmot Proviso as the first step going to the war. That was David Wilmot. The big issue, of course, the big hidden issue that nobody wanted to talk about, the elephant in the room we call that, was slavery. So all the crises we have along the way have something to do with slavery. And the big issue from the end of the Mexican-American War all the way up to the Civil War is, or up to maybe 1855 at least, is what do we do with all the land that we won from Mexico? They call all that land the Mexican Cession, C-E. The word cession comes from the word cede, to give something up. There were people that had different ideas about whether or not to introduce slavery there. And a young fellow named David Wilmot, and I think I talked about him last time, came up with the idea. He was a New York, or Pennsylvania senator. Came up with the idea. Let's not let any slavery go into these new territories. Other people wanted the territories to be able to make up their own mind. There were all sorts of arguments. But Wilmot's proviso passed through the House of Representatives. It was going to have to pass through the House of Representatives first and the Senate as well. And it just ran into a wall in the Senate. Nobody would buy in. They couldn't get, the votes were split. They couldn't get enough votes. And it got so bad that they kept being reintroduced, and finally, when the House was yakking at the Senate because the Senate wouldn't pass it and the House had already passed it, finally President Polk, because he's still president at this stage of the game, this is during the war, it's before the war's over, they were already predicting what we were going to win. President Polk said, please take that law somewhere and table it until the dust settles so we can get other business done. We can't even pass a budget or anything because you're arguing about this. And so he withdrew it, but people like John Quincy Adams and others, they wouldn't let go of the issue. And they kept arguing about it. But this is what I call my first step towards the Civil War. Of course, we're going to have an election in 1848. Those three fine gentlemen are going to run. Martin Van Buren, that's a good test question. I'll put the picture up and you've got to identify them. You like that? Martin Van Buren, Zachary Taylor, and Lewis Cass are the three people that are going to run. Now we have three parties in action. We actually had a lot of small parties, but kind of nobody cares kind of parties. They're going to, I'm trying to find, Zachary Taylor will be the candidate for the Whig Party. The Whig Party wanted something called popular sovereignty. The local areas should make up their mind whether they have slaves or not the federal government. Lewis Cass ran for the Democrats. He'd been the Secretary of War under Andrew Jackson. He'd been nominated for president earlier, at least once. He was a senator from Michigan. He came up with another idea, that idea that I just said, about letting the states make up their own mind. They called that the doctrine of popular sovereignty. Let me see if I can find a specific. Maybe not. Maybe I don't have it. There it is. Popular sovereignty. Let me get it up so you guys can see it. There's old Lewis Cass. He looks kind of like a fat Napoleon, doesn't he, with his hands stuck in his shirt. A lot of people have their picture taken that way. I have yet to figure out why. Unless maybe they were scratching or something. I don't know. Anyway, leave it to the people who will be affected by this, is what he said. So let the people in that state make up their own mind. Now, of course, the abolitionists didn't want that. They wanted it just to be a rule that nobody could have slaves. And the pro-slavery people wanted a rule that said you could have slaves. So now we've got three different groups. So he's going to support popular sovereignty as a Democrat. The Whigs support free state, free soil, and so does the Free Soil Party. Free Soil Party is just a one-issue party. All it cares about is abolition of slavery, and all the other stuff, forget about it. Zachary Taylor's going to win this one. The hero, old, rough, and ready. He becomes the 12th President of the United States. He'll be sworn into office in 1849. He's going to die in 1850. So this is another one of those short presidencies. The second time where we lose a president before the end of his term of office. He's going to do some interesting things. One of them, he gets a treaty with the British. We're still behaving with the British like two dogs in a playground or something, sniffing each other, walking around in circles. we had decided long before we were going to at least get along with the British well enough not to go to war with them again. We'd already had 2 wars with them. But we really didn't trust them. And we had ambitions and they had ambitions. And sometimes our ambitions crossed each other. For example, there were some islands out off the west coast, well, pretty far off the west coast, out in the Pacific, called the Sandwich Islands. Anybody know about them? Ever heard of them? Never heard? They were named after a guy named Sandwich. And the reason that sounds funny is that the sandwich was named after him. What he was doing is, I can't remember, he was a card player or something like that. And he invented this way to eat and still hold his cards. And that turned out to be a sandwich. And these islands were discovered, I say, quote, discovered, end quote, by the British. And they named them after Lord Sandwich. We were interested in the islands too because they had sugar and pineapples on that island, which were worth a lot of money. Sugar was a major industry. It was big in Cuba. We couldn't really grow enough of it in the States because our weather wasn't right for it. And our American investors were very interested in it. Now, the British were doing a lot of stuff in the Caribbean. And they had an idea that we also had, way back, maybe from the time that Grant was still president. Well, way before that, way before the Civil War even. If we could cut a canal across where the Isthmus of Panama is, we could get to the West Coast a lot faster than we could going all the way around South America. And it would give us, if we control that canal, it would give us the advantage going out to places like the Sandwich Islands. The British thought the same thing. If they could do that, they could get that advantage. And so, because we were suspicious of each other, we finally decided, let's make a deal. And that was the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. And basically, we made a deal that said, if you don't do it, we won't do it. And if you do it, then we'll do it with you. And if you do it, then we get a right to use it. If we do it, you get the right to use it. And it was not just about a canal. The other thought was build a big railroad straight across the isthmus so you could bring ships to the railroad, ship stuff across, and pick them up with ships on the other side. That treaty is going to be in effect until 1901 or 2. We also, while Zachary Taylor was president for that short time, had a lot of Americans who were trying to interfere in things in Cuba to get the U.S. government involved in it so we would grab Cuba from the Spanish. They wanted the gold that was in Cuba and they wanted the sugar. Once again, sugar is a big thing. And the president says, we're not doing that. Knock it off or else go to jail. They call that kind of adventure, back then the name of it was filibuster. We have a different meaning for filibuster now. Domestically, he wasn't a politician. He didn't really care about domestic politics. He didn't think a president should interfere with Congress very much. He didn't think a president should veto bills that Congress passed. He did like the idea of a national bank. And he really wanted, now that the war's over and all of that, and we're arguing about what to do with this land, he wanted California to come into the Union quickly. And he wanted New Mexico territory to organize so it could come into the Union as a state quickly. One of the things he wanted we got. The other thing, it's going to take forever for New Mexico to get in. Because he's going to die. He has gastroenteritis. I think all of us have had what the doctor calls gastroenteritis. It's just, a really bad stomach bug. He developed that, and unfortunately for him, American medical science was still pretty retarded, and the doctors probably killed him trying to cure him. They fed him calomel and ipecac and opium and quinine, and then when that didn't work, they tried bleeding him. Doctors used to think that was a way to cure. They let all the disease pass out of your body and your blood, right? The fact that it might weaken you to the point of dying didn't even occur to them. He died in July of 1850. He's going to be replaced by his vice president. We haven't even mentioned him, by the name of Millard Fillmore. He'd been the governor of New York. He was our 12th vice president. He'll become our 13th president. He was a pretty accomplished guy to be an accidental president. As governor of New York, he'd founded the University of New York. He'd revised the whole New York banking system, which was one of the largest banking systems in our country. When he became vice president, he was the chairman of all the discussions about what to do with all the land that we got from the Mexicans. We're going to work up a compromise called the Compromise of 1850. We'll get to it in a minute. He had to send troops into New Mexico because a lot of the newcomers to New Mexico after the Mexican-American War were kind of shouldering people that were already living there out, and there was violence. He also sent an American naval squadron out to visit a little country we knew very little about, except that their doors were locked, called Japan. Japan had decided, watching what was happening to China, that they didn't need any foreigners there. They didn't want anyone interfering with their way of life or anything. So it was illegal for foreigners to come to Japan, and it was illegal for Japanese to leave the country. If they left the country according to their law, they couldn't come back. And if they came back, it was a capital offense. They were subject to being executed. But Matthew Perry, who's a cousin of Oliver Hazard Perry from War of 1812 fame, Matthew Perry takes his little squadron and goes up to, I think, maybe Yokohama and demands to see who the boss is of Japan, and manages to get them to agree to let Americans come and do business there. Not really go into the heartland of Japan, but be there. And I think the Japanese really hoodwinked the Americans because we thought we were talking to the big cheese in Japan. The big cheese in Japan was what you call a shogun, and he was a member of the Tokugawa shogunate, and I think they just sent some guy out to meet with us to act like he was the shogun. We thought we were talking to the emperor, actually, and the emperor never talked to foreigners. But anyway, those are some of the things Fillmore did as president. When he was vice president, he's the guy that helped push this compromise we're about to talk about. The Compromise of 1850 is my step 2. Among other things, they're going to make this great big, what you call an omnibus bill, a bill that's got something for everybody in it. And to admit California, to leave Utah and Mexico, to bring Utah and Mexico in, to reorganize Texas a little bit. They're also thinking about making it easier for slave owners to recover runaway slaves. But because it was an omnibus bill and it had so many things in it, there was something in that bill that everybody didn't like. I mean, any given person would dislike something in that bill, badly enough not to want to vote for it. So they couldn't get it passed. And they were afraid it would cause a war if they couldn't settle the issue. And John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, pro-slavery guy, Henry Clay, pro-American system guy, Daniel Webster, an anti-slavery guy, they all get together and say, we don't want to have a war, let's have a compromise. But they couldn't figure out how to get this through the Senate. It got through the House of Representatives with some objections. So a young congressman, where is he? Named Stephen A. Douglas. There he is. He's a congressman from Illinois, great speaker, kind of short guy, but a good voice, good debater, who's interested in the railroad industry. We'll talk about that later. He's going to tell them, gentlemen, if you want this to pass through Congress, break it up into smaller pieces and get the smaller pieces passed one at a time. You still get everything you want that way. And so they did that. That's what becomes the Compromise of 1850. There's 5 separate laws in the Compromise of 1850. The first one admits California to the Union as a free state. Now, California had already indicated to the government that that's what they wanted to be. They wanted to be a free state. The majority of the people in California were for being a free state. The next act they passed was the Texas-New Mexico Act. That's going to kind of reorganize Texas's borders. They were claiming half the world. So they're going to kind of chop that down a little bit, and they're going to offer Texas about $10 million in compensation, and they're going to organize New Mexico Territory. That's the Texas-New Mexico Act. Then they allow Utah to organize so that it can get ready to be a state. Interestingly, in the Texas-New Mexico Act, in the Utah Act, there was one thing that was not mentioned at all. What would you guess that would be? Considering that it's the biggest issue of the time. They didn't say a word in either one of these 2 laws about slavery. Not, you will have it, you won't have it, or anything. Then the Southerners insisted on it, and to get it through Congress, the other laws passed. They passed a Fugitive Slave Act, which forced authorities everywhere in the country to cooperate with Southerners trying to recover escaped slaves. Didn't go over real well up in the North. That made people really angry. The members of Congress passed it because they wanted to get the whole bill through. They also agreed to end the slave trade in Washington, D.C., which is kind of ridiculous because Washington, D.C. is so small, it doesn't matter. It didn't end slavery, it just ended the slave trade. And if you were living in Washington, D.C., and you had a buggy and a halfway fast horse, you could get out of the state in 5 minutes and be somewhere where it was legal to trade slaves. So who cares? They did it as window dressing to make the abolitionists happy. Fugitive Slave Act bill caused a lot of anger in the North. They tried to figure out ways to resist it. In theory, if you're a sheriff or if you're like a police commissioner up in New York City, if a representative came up from the South and said, this man is a slave, you had to help him catch the guy, bring him before a tribunal. They would rule on whether or not he was in fact a slave. There were people who had never been a slave that got sent to the South in chains because of the way the magistrate ruled. And the slave, or the African-American fellow, had no right to defend himself before the tribunal. People up north were really angry. All those things listed there, Prigg versus Pennsylvania, Shadrach Menken's affair, the Christiana incident, the Jerry Rescue, all of those were violence opposing the fugitive slave law. Like, if a guy knew that he was about to be dragged before the magistrates, these people came out to defend him and told the people who wanted to arrest him, just try and arrest him. And there was violence. There was violence and anger that their representatives and their senators had voted for this bill. One of the most vehement complainers was a representative from Pennsylvania named Thaddeus Stevens, and he will be the leader of the abolition movement in the House of Representatives. He'll be the leader of the civil rights movement at the conclusion of the Civil War. Pretty hardline kind of guy. There's old Stephen Douglas again. We got another election coming up in 1852. This time, the Whigs pick a different guy. Of course, Zachary Taylor's dead. They didn't want Millard Fillmore because he was wishy-washy about slavery. So they picked General Winfield Scott, who's getting along in age by this time, but of course he was another one of the heroes from the Mexican-American War. The Democrats picked Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire. I think, unless I'm wrong, he's the only person ever nominated for the president from New Hampshire in our history. Franklin Pierce wasn't what you'd expect a Northerner to be. He was a dough-face, and I'll explain to you what a dough-face is in a minute. The Democratic Convention had a whole bunch of guys that wanted to run. Pierce wasn't even really in the forefront at all. James Buchanan of Pennsylvania wanted to run. Lewis Cass of Michigan wanted to run. Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois wanted to run. William Marcy of New York wanted to run. But they got in big arguments over the different things in the Compromise of 1850. So nobody could get enough votes to win. And finally, on the 49th ballot, they picked this guy from New Hampshire, Franklin Pierce. And a lot of people don't even know what they really got when they picked him, because a lot of people didn't know who he was. The Whig Party is going to nominate Winfield Scott, but it'll take 43 ballots to get him to win over Millard Fillmore, who was the sitting president at the time. Remember, he was the vice president. He became president. Fillmore got the most votes the first time around. But eventually, people got tired of it, and the votes shifted to General Scott. Daniel Webster also wanted to run, but he didn't get very many votes at all. So Fillmore's out, which is probably a pity, although Winfield Scott, I don't know, he was a decent enough guy, and it doesn't matter which one of them won the nomination. And there's another party, we'll call it the Know-Nothings. Eventually some people called it the American Party, which was a sad misnomer. It was made up of nativists. What's a nativist? Nativists are people who discriminate against new people who come to our country. And it's funny because last year's immigrant is this year's nativist sometimes. They were anti-Catholic too. They didn't like Irish Catholics. They didn't like other immigrants, period. They tried to slow down immigration and naturalization. Membership was limited to Protestant men. They got the name Know Nothing because they operated in secret. In 1852, they nominated Daniel Webster. In 1856, they'll nominate Millard Fillmore. If anybody asked him, well, what did you do in your convention? I don't know. So they started calling him the Know-Nothing. That's the election. All the blue states went for Pierce. The kind of, whatever color that is, states went for Scott. So he won a pretty solid win. He got 254 electoral votes as opposed to Scott's 42. Maybe if they'd nominated Millard Fillmore, he might have had a better chance. They didn't think about that. Franklin Pierce, 14th President of the United States. On my list of all the presidents, either the worst or the second worst president in our history. He was a dough-faced Northerner. Dough-faced Northerners, this is way before the war, that was a slang expression for the people who sympathized with the pro-slavery view of the South, even though they're from up north. Single term. He's only going to last one term. While he's president, we're going to make that Gadsden Purchase, that little sliver of land down where southern Arizona is now. Also, he's going to be incredibly embarrassed by something called the Austin Manifesto. I think I have a slide on that. and he's going to follow up on the Perry mission to Japan. And while he's president, they're going to pass the disastrous Kansas-Nebraska Act, and we'll talk about all those things. What was the dough phase? Gadsden Purchase we talked about before. We talked about it when we talked about the Mexican Cession. The Austin Manifesto. Get this. We wanted somehow to get our sticky little fingers on Cuba. At least Pierce did. And so he told some of his smarter diplomats over in Europe, at least they were supposed to be smarter, get together and have kind of a, what do you call it now? A session where you just throw ideas out. Brainstorm session. And consider all the different ways that we might be able to get hold of Cuba. Ranging from buying it from Spain all the way across to taking it from Spain. And things in between. So they got together in Austin in Belgium at the suggestion of the Secretary of State. Minister to our ambassador to Spain, Pierre Sol, our ambassador to Britain, James Buchanan, later to become a president, and our minister to France, John Mason. They met in Austin, Belgium, and they came up with this ideas. What are our options to get hold of Cuba? Now they're supposed to take this and secretly transmit it to the president for his consideration. Someone leaked it. And it gets in all the European newspapers. And the Spanish, to start with, since they own Cuba, they are infuriated. And this is kind of a giveaway. The British are also very angry about it. Why would the British care about Cuba? Maybe they had ambitions about Cuba too. But the whole world just explodes about this. I mean, they're angry about it. So the president has to kind of back down from it, talk his way out of it. It was a big embarrassment to us, to Pierce's presidency, etc. Something else that happened just before he was elected was Harriet Beecher Stowe's book. This is step 3 on my list. Uncle Tom's Cabin. Totally fiction. You've probably read it or heard about it before. The ironic thing about Uncle Tom's Cabin is that people use the term pejoratively. You're an Uncle Tom for a black person that's cozy with the white people kind of thing. Uncle Tom in this book was not an Uncle Tom. He wasn't cozy with the master. Somebody forgot to read the book before they used the term. This was probably the second most published book, second only to the Bible. It was published all around the world. It painted a really grim picture of Southern slavery. The picture it painted didn't purport to be the truth, but the picture it painted was grim and pretty accurate. The people in the South were furious about this book because they saw it telling all the people around the world how bad they were. And I said, it's not true. It's scandalous. It's libelous. It's slandering us. But people read it. I mean, they read it as far to the east as China, Japan, Thailand, really out of the world, out of the way places, all over Europe, of course. What an embarrassment, especially to the South. Now, the people up north thought it was funny. They didn't think the book was funny. They thought the discomfort the South was feeling about it was funny. Best-selling novel of the 19th century. Second best-selling book of that century following the Bible. Of the whole century. Over 1 million copies sold in Britain alone. 300,000 copies sold in the United States. There are a lot of Southern writers who are going to write protests against Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in your readings in Unit 9, there'll be at least one example of that. Okay, step 4. We're getting there. We only have 10 steps. Step 4, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Our friend Stephen A. Douglas introduced when he was helping with the Compromise of 1850. He's a railroad man at heart. He wants to run a north-south railroad. I think it's supposed to come out somewhere around Mobile, Alabama. We didn't have any major north-south railroads. All of our major railroads went east and west. It was going to have to go through uncharted territory that wasn't organized into a state yet. That made it difficult for him to figure out how to buy the land. So he wanted that part of the country to become a state. Now there's a huge territory. If you look on this map, it's already split. But this whole territory from the Canadian border all the way down to Indian Territory, all the way down to the Missouri Compromise line, really, was all called Kansas Territory. A small part of that is going to be organized with Stephen A. Douglas pushing them along in order to become a state, so that people own property and he can buy property to put his railroad on. Go figure. He comes up with a bill he thinks that can pass through Congress, that he can persuade people to vote for. It's called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The first thing it does, it splits those two pieces of what was called Kansas Territory into 2 territories. The northernmost piece, the largest piece, will be the Nebraska Territory. The southern piece will be Kansas Territory. That's the first part of the act. The second part of the act, it repealed the Missouri Compromise. 3630 and all of that. The third thing it did for this territory was instituted popular sovereignty. So the federal government doesn't get a say on whether there's slavery or not, only the local people. Strangely enough, or not so strangely, the South supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act because they figured they could gain the ascendancy in the territory by rushing Southerners into that territory and getting control of it. Most of the North said, bad idea. Franklin Pierce supported it. Stephen A. Douglas, of course, it was his idea. He supported it. South Carolinians were against it. The Kentuckians were against it. Almost all of the Southern senators were against it. Were in favor of it. Against it, Northern senators like Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, William Seward from New York, Salmon Chase from Ohio, Thomas Hart Benton from Missouri, Sam Houston. He's a Southerner. Why is he against it? Why do you think Sam Houston didn't like it? He didn't like it because he thought it would start a war, and he'd spent half of his life fighting to make Texas a state in the United States, and he thought it would blow that right down the toilet. And of course, until he died, he was against Texas seceding from the Union. They put him under arrest during the Civil War. He died during the war. Okay, it passes. And the big split's made of Kansas Territory into Nebraska and Kansas Territory. What am I doing here? Okay. Where is this going to start? This is going to start something we call Bleeding Kansas. Why is it Bleeding Kansas? Well, the pro-slavery people are going to send ruffians and whoever else they can into that state to try and make the people decide to have pro-slave state. The Northerners are going to send as many of their people in there as they can to try and get them to vote for being a free state. and it gets violent, and it goes way beyond what you call civilized debate. It's going to last from 1854 all the way up to about the beginning of the Civil War, before they settle the argument of free state or slave state. Eventually, it will become a free state. But there is fraud, there's violence, there's fighting between the two sides, murders, mayhem, and of course, all the bad will and all that radiates outward to all the rest of the country. So the rest of the country is very uncomfortable too. Let's talk about the chronology. 1854, pro-slavery border ruffians crossed into Kansas from Missouri, which was a slave state. Listen to the numbers, 1,600 of them registered to vote. They cast 6,000 ballots. Go figure that one. There's only 1,600 registered voters. There's 6,000 votes. Wonder how that worked. In 1855, they're going to try again. It won't be any more successful. In July of 1855, there'll be another meeting at Pawnee. There were no big cities. Pawnee, Shawnee Mission. In August of 1855, the Free Soilers, the people in favor of not having slavery, meet in a little place called Topeka, and they vote to be a free state. The President of the United States, several months later, condemns the Free Soilers for causing trouble. He's really pro-slavery. In May of 1856, pro-slavers attack Lawrence, Kansas, because the Free Soilers live there, and they have a couple of newspapers, and they're saying bad things about pro-slavery people. So they attack the town. They burn down the only hotel in the town. It wasn't that big a town. They burn down the only hotel in town. They destroy 2 print shops, burn and loot people's homes. One guy gets killed almost by accident. I don't know how he got killed. Several weeks later, a fellow by the name of John Brown, who is a diehard Free Soiler, anti-slavery guy, thinks maybe God talks to him. I don't know what his problem was. He goes down there, finds a farm that's got slaves on it, and hacks up the owners. He and several of his sons and some of their friends chop up the owners with machetes or with swords. They didn't even want to waste bullets. They went to a next farm next over there and shot a bunch of people. Then, of course, they had to disappear pretty quickly in fear of retribution. But we haven't heard the last of John Brown. President Pierce, in July, is going to send in troops to maintain the peace, he says. In Congress, in 1856, you're going to have the caning of Charles Sumner. In 1856, a new president will also be elected, Buchanan. In 1857, while Buchanan's president, a constitution will be drafted and sent to the president. He likes it. He sends it to Congress. Congress says it's corrupt and throws it in the trash can. Let's look at the politics of this. That's a glorious picture of John Brown, like he's like God's angel or something. He fought for the right cause, but his methodology was somewhat flawed. Can't go around chopping people up. On the other side of things, or another abolitionist, remember Henry Ward Beecher, the son of Lyman Beecher, the Beecher family that had Harriet Beecher Stowe and Catherine Beecher? He's a preacher, right? He's sending lots of boxloads of Bibles. They're marked Bibles on the outside of the book, of the box. Actually, what's in the box are Sharp's rifles. He's sending them down to the Free Soilers to defend themselves. They started calling them Beecher's Bibles. I think every time I've ever done an exam on this period of time in history, I always have a question saying, how many pages are there in the Beecher's Bible? And you wouldn't believe how many people get it wrong. Henry Ward Beecher contributed funds for these rifles. Kansas, on both sides, they keep passing constitutions. The Topeka Constitution is a free one. That's thrown away by the president. The Lecompton Constitution is a pro-slave one. That's approved by the president, but not approved by Congress. The Leavenworth Constitution is a free state constitution, but it also includes women's rights. How'd that slip in there? The president, Buchanan, receives it. He never gives it to Congress to vote on it. And finally, in 1859, the Wyandotte Constitution, also a free state constitution, no women's rights in this one, is accepted by both the president and Congress. Kansas won't be admitted as a free state until January of 1861, but they will be admitted. 1854, same time that they do the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and you get Bleeding Kansas. A bunch of ex-Free Soil Party people, ex-Whigs, modernists, some people from the old American Party, that one that weren't such straight shooters themselves, they get together up in Jackson, Michigan. They say we need all to get together to end slavery. They form a party they call the Republican Party in homage to Thomas Jefferson. I don't know if I have their platform. They're going to run a president in 1856. John C. Fremont will be their nominee. The guy that was involved in the Mexican-American War, kind of a self-advertiser. While this is going on and Bleeding Kansas is going on, the violence reaches the floors of the United States Congress. During a debate, Senator Charles Sumner refers to a Southern senator by the name of Andrew Butler in a non-complimentary way. I don't know if you guys have ever heard about the famous Spanish book Don Quixote, about the guy that he's got a few screws loose and he imagines himself a knight of the old days and he's crusading for women's rights and the justice and all that, but his enemies are windmills. He thinks those are the big enemy, and so you hear the term, you're jousting with windmills. It comes from Don Quixote. And Don Quixote had a faithful sidekick named Sancho Panza, who was kind of a half-witted guy that followed him around everywhere and acted as his squire. And Senator Sumner said that Stephen A. Douglas and Andrew Butler of South Carolina were like Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. That outraged Senator Butler's nephew, a guy by the name of Preston Brooks, and he comes into the Senate office building, hunts down Senator Sumner, and beats him almost to death with a terracotta cane. I mean, they ripped his desk up off the floor, moved the desk. Sumner went running out onto the floor of the Senate with this Preston Brooks following him, whacking at him with this stick. He's bleeding. He's in really bad shape. Finally, some other senators and the sergeant-at-arms of the Senate break them up. Preston Brooks is kicked out of the House of Representatives. He goes back home to South Carolina. He runs for re-election in a special election, and they send him right back. Charles Sumner has to go to Europe, to the spas, to the health spas. It takes him about 1.5 years to recover from the beating. he's not going to be a friend of the South when he gets back. Just a sign of the violence that was just permeating the whole country over this issue. Then we come to the election of 1856. Nobody likes Pierce. His own party doesn't like him anymore. The other party has their own candidate. The Republican Party is going to have a convention, and they choose John C. Fremont as their candidate, with John McClain of Ohio as the vice presidential candidate. The American Party is going to have a convention. They're going to pick former President Millard Fillmore as their candidate. I can't imagine why he decided to run with them, but there are other people. Sam Houston was in the contest, so was John Bell of Tennessee, Robert Stockton, the naval hero from the War of the Mexican-American War. All of these guys are going to try and run. Garrett Davis was a congressman from Kentucky, but they're going to pick Millard Fillmore to be their candidate. The Democratic Party, that's strange. They're going to they have the seated president as one of their guys, Franklin Pierce. Stephen A. Douglas wants to run. Lewis Cass wants to run. They're both pro-popular sovereignty. They vote 17 times, and finally they decide on James Buchanan Jr. of Pennsylvania, who was pro-slavery, which is really unusual for Pennsylvania. John Breckinridge of Kentucky will be his vice presidential running mate. So it's Buchanan against Fremont against Fillmore. If there was any justice, Fillmore would have won, but it would have helped the American Party, which wasn't a very good party. John C. Fremont has very little chance. The Republican Party is a brand new party. James Buchanan is really going to cover most of the map. Some northern states will vote for Fremont. Fillmore barely gets any electoral votes, even though he was a fairly popular president. James Buchanan, 15th President of the United States. Here's what James Buchanan said about slavery. Listen to these carefully phrased words. Slaves are, quote, treated with kindness and humanity. Both the philanthropy and the self-interest of the master have combined to produce this humane result. What is he saying? He says, because they feel compassion for them, they treat them well, and also because they're his property, he doesn't want to damage it. That was his take on slavery. Doesn't make him very popular up north, or in his own home state. Step number 6. What was step number 5 again? The caning of Charles Sumner in Congress. Step number 6. The Dred Scott case. I'm not going to get into all the details, but Dred Scott, what you used to call a Batman, in not like the flying bats, in the military, a senior officer would have a guy that was with him all the time that was sort of his personal servant, took care of his logistics and having his clothes ready and stuff like that. In this case, Dred Scott was a slave attached to an army officer named Sanford. I can't remember his first name. And they went into a free state. And then they came back out of the free state. And his owner died. And his owner's brother inherited him. And Dred Scott and the owner, his new owner, got together and they decided they had a really brilliant idea. They were going to take it to court, and Dred Scott would sue his new owner for his freedom because he'd been in a free state. That made him a free man. You can't make him into a slave again. And they tried it out in Missouri, and that didn't work too well because Missouri was a pro-slave state. But what they wanted was to get it to the Supreme Court, and it gets to the Supreme Court. Now at this time, I have the opportunity to embarrass everybody by asking them, who is the Chief Justice? John Marshall died. Who did Andrew Jackson appoint to take his place? Anybody? Nobody? Who was the guy that helped Andrew Jackson take the money out of the banks, out of the National Bank, and put it in the pet banks? Roger B. Taney. He was a lawyer. He'd been the Attorney General, and then he made him temporarily the Treasurer, the Secretary of the Treasury, and then he appointed him to replace John Marshall, who passed away in 1835. He's the man that's going to read the ruling on Dred Scott. It's an interesting ruling. It happens on 6 March. You'll notice that all these steps we've talked about, at each step, somebody gets mad about something. This one will really cause people to be mad too. First thing in the ruling, any person descended from Africans, whether slave or free, is not a citizen of the United States, according to the Declaration of Independence. That should have ended it right there, because if you're not a citizen, you can't go to court, can you? But they didn't stop. They said the ordinance of 1787, the Northwest Ordinance, that said no slaves north of the Bend in the Ohio River, was not constitutional, and they threw that out. And they also said that the Missouri Compromise wasn't constitutional, and they threw that out. Well, that doesn't matter. It was already thrown out by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This infuriated people in the North. And they all just decided the Supreme Court's just pro-South. They were furious. Now, what happened to Dred Scott? Well, he got his freedom anyway. A bunch of sympathizers just put together some money, and they went through the formality of buying his freedom for him. So he had the papers to prove he was free. But it was one more thing that made one side of this North-South argument angry. There's old Roger B. Taney. 1857, another step. Step number 7. The Panic of 1857. Banks start collapsing. Why? Believe it or not, we had too much gold. And because we had so much gold, the value of gold, which was usually what we established our money on, the value of gold began to drop. And several big investment houses fell apart. And they called in their debts that the railroads owed them, because the railroads were always in debt. And the railroads failed. I mean, a whole bunch of our major railroads went bankrupt. The government started deficit spending money they didn't have. But the main effect was political, and the reason it's kind of more convoluted than some of the other things. In this case, up north, they really felt this panic. In the South, they didn't feel it so much. Why? They still had slaves, they still had cotton. So even though all this credit stuff is going bad, the South didn't feel this panic so much, which made the North really angry. That's why you're so rich down there, because you have slaves. That is wrong. So once again, another step in the direction of being so angry with each other that they can't back down. What's that? Oh, this thing used to be narrated. That picture in the corner is yours truly reading a narration, and one of my pets was sitting on my shoulder while I was doing it. He wasn't invited. He just flew into the room. I did this for a bunch of high school students, and they didn't learn any history, but they all wanted to know what the bird's name was. Can we watch Having a Game, Mr. Hunt? No, what you don't see in that picture is when the bird came in and lighted on my shoulder, 4 dogs came running into the room trying to catch the bird. It was madhouse for a minute. Okay, 1858, less than a year after the Dred Scott decision, you have a famous speech made by a congressman who wasn't going to get reelected, but he's going to run for a different office. He made a famous speech called the House Divided speech. He's talking about this division between the North and the South. And he says, a house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided by this issue. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates, the advocates of slavery, will push it forward till it shall become lawful in all the states, old as well as new. And if you've heard this house divided, it's straight out of the Bible. And if a house shall be divided against itself, that house shall not stand. Mark 3:25. Then, step 8, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. What's that all about? Abraham Lincoln was out of the Congress and wanted to become a senator. He was out of the House of Representatives. He wanted to run for senator. So he's going to have to run against Stephen A. Douglas, the Democrat. Abe Lincoln has now become, he was a Whig, now he's become a Republican. Abe Lincoln was kind of tall and ugly, looked a little strange, had kind of a nasal voice. Stephen A. Douglas was an accomplished debater. Doesn't mean Abe Lincoln was stupid, by means. What I'm saying is, he didn't look good. If looks mattered, he had 2 strikes against him. Stephen A. Douglas had a great voice, was used to projecting his voice, and when they had the debates, they didn't have TV, radio, or anything like that. You got up on the back of a wagon, and you made your speech as loud as you could, so as many people as possible could hear it. Douglas beat Lincoln, according to the newspapers, almost everywhere they went. But I will tell you right now that Abraham Lincoln is very possibly the smartest politician we've ever had in the United States. And not an evil one. When they got to Freeport, Illinois, they have another debate. Now remember, we've just had the Dred Scott decision. We've also had people trying to sell the idea of popular sovereignty. See, the Dred Scott decision, the way it came out, makes popular sovereignty impossible. Because, according to the Dred Scott decision, you can't make people of another race free people and citizens. And Abraham Lincoln says, Mr. Douglas, you have come out saying you support the Dred Scott decision. Yes. And yet, you have also run for office saying you support popular sovereignty. Can you explain the logic of that? Stephen A. Douglas, what am I going to say now? Comes up with this convoluted answer along the lines of, the people of the state don't have to pass a law that supports one doctrine or the other. They have a choice, etc., etc. It takes off the people in favor of slavery. It takes off the people in favor of popular sovereignty. It takes off the people against slavery. Abraham Lincoln has cornered him. The thing is, though, they're talking from a stump or from the top of a wagon. It didn't influence the race for senator at all. Stephen A. Douglas is going to win it. But by the time that's over with, this has gone in the newspapers, and now everyone knows about it. And you can say that the Freeport Doctrine and the Lincoln-Douglas debates, they made a senator out of Stephen A. Douglas, but they also won they lost the presidential election for him in 1860. Step number 9. John Brown returns. John Brown and some of his sons and a bunch of fellow travelers get on a train. They plan to go down to Harper's Ferry, Virginia. It's now West Virginia. Raid the federal arsenal there, take the guns out, provide them to all the slaves they can find, and start a general slave insurrection all over the South. Guess who turns them in? An African American. Go see the authorities and say, this crazy man's going to start pouring blood all over the country. President Buchanan gets news of this. He looks around. In Washington, he doesn't have a whole lot of soldiers or anything. I need some military men to go down and deal with John Brown. He's going to cross the Potomac River. He's going to seize the arsenal. Start this rebellion. The president doesn't have a handy military unit. There's no army units close by that can react fast enough. He goes to a senior army officer. He's an up-and-coming colonel in the U.S. Army. He's an artillery specialist. His name is Robert E. Lee. Ever hear that name before? Mr. Lee, go down and take care of John Brown. We can't have this. It will cause big trouble. Robert E. Lee couldn't find any soldiers around, so he had to go down to the Naval Yard in Washington, D.C., and get a company or so of United States Marines and say, come with me. They jump on a train and they go down to Harper's Ferry, where they find that John Brown has already grabbed the arsenal. A few people have been killed. All the South Carolina or the North Carolina militia and people are flocking in to fight against John Brown. First thing Robert E. Lee has to do is go to all the local militia and say, you go home. We will have no mayhem. You go home. This is the business of the federal government. And eventually he's going to capture John Brown. John Brown's wounded in the fight. They surround the arsenal. They drag him out, put him under arrest. They put him on trial. They convict him of treason. They take him to what is now known as Charlestown. It was Charlestown, Virginia. It's now known as Charleston, West Virginia. And he's hanged on the 2nd of December of 1859. People up north, some of the really strong abolitionists, they're aghast. They're shocked by this. They consider him an avenging angel, John Brown. Ralph Waldo Emerson and David Thoreau praise Brown in public. Walt Whitman actually goes down to witness the hanging. He feels so moved by it. Strangely enough, one of the most important of all the abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison, says, that's not the way we handle these problems. That was wrong. Abraham Lincoln, who is against slavery, says, you can't do those things. So even the anti-slavery camp is split by this. Walt Whitman writes a poem about marching up on the gallows and being hanged. There's an interesting side story to this. We've got just enough time for me to tell you. John Brown couldn't do this unless he had the money to get down there with his guys. How did he get down there? There were 6 abolitionist people, some famous, some not so famous. Thomas Higginson, Samuel Gridley, Howe, Theodore Parker, he's one of the Unitarians that started Brook Farm. Garrett Smith, he's one of the guys that started the Free Soil Party. George Luther Stearns. They hanged John Brown for treason. What did they find out? We gave him money. So they scatter in all directions. One of them checks into an insane asylum. 1 runs, 2 run for, 3 run for Canada. 1 goes all the way over to Europe. They're afraid the government's going to arrest them too. Nothing happens. Step 10, the final step, we will talk about next class. You don't want to miss it. So those of you who are planning to go off on a quick vacation a little bit early, it's not yet, is it? When does it come? Is it next week? Or is it the week after? When's Thanksgiving? What's the date today? It's next week, isn't it? Yeah, show up on Monday. And we'll talk about the election of 1860, which is the beginning, basically, of the Civil War. It's a really interesting election, both what the Republicans did and what the Democrats did. Don't forget there's something due in on Friday, midnight.